The choices that haunt us forever are almost never the difficult ones. They're the ordinary ones we never thought we'd remember. I didn't know a single word spoken on a rainy Thursday night could become the heaviest burden I would ever carry. My name is Damian Russo. People know me as the man who owns half the city without ever putting his name on a single building. They whisper when I walk into a room. They lower their voices when they say my last name. Fear has a strange way of introducing you before you ever speak. None of that mattered the night I met her. Rain washed over Manhattan in endless silver lines, turning every streetlight into a blurred halo across the pavement. I had just finished a meeting that should have lasted 1 hour, but somehow consumed 4. Marco, my driver, waited beside the black SUV while 2 security men scanned the nearly empty street. "Home, boss?" Marco asked as he opened the rear door. I was about to answer when the bell above the entrance of a small neighborhood diner rang softly. A woman stepped outside, hugging a faded blue coat tightly around herself. She couldn't have been older than 30. Long chestnut hair clung to her damp shoulders. Her face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting life to become easier. She locked the diner's front door, glanced toward the empty bus stop across the street, then looked down at her phone. Whatever she saw made her shoulders sink a little farther. She took a slow breath before beginning the long walk through the rain. "Boss?" Marco asked again. I followed the woman with my eyes for reasons I couldn't explain. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She simply looked tired. The kind of tired that sleep could never fix. A few seconds later, she hesitated beside the curb as if gathering the courage to do something uncomfortable. Then she turned and walked toward our SUV. One of my security men instinctively stepped forward before I raised a hand, signaling him to stand down. She stopped several feet away, careful not to invade anyone's space. Even in the rain, she managed an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly. Her voice carried warmth despite the cold. "This is probably a strange question." I waited. The last bus already left. She glanced toward the dark street before looking back at me. "I have a little girl waiting at home with my neighbor." I was wondering. She hesitated, embarrassed. "Could you possibly give me a ride? I don't live far." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Marco looked at me, waiting for instructions. My security team remained perfectly still. I studied her face. Gentle blue eyes. Damp strands of hair sticking to her cheeks. A canvas work bag hanging from one shoulder. Nothing about her seemed threatening. Yet my entire life had been built on one rule. Never blur the line between business and strangers. Kindness could become vulnerability. Vulnerability could become regret. I had repeated that lesson to myself for years until it felt less like advice and more like law. "I'm sorry," I finally said. My voice remained calm, respectful. "I can't." She nodded immediately, almost before I finished speaking. There was no anger, no disappointment, only acceptance, as if hearing no had become another ordinary part of her life. "I understand," she replied with a small smile. "Thank you anyway." She stepped back onto the sidewalk, pulled her coat tighter around herself, and disappeared into the rain without looking back once. Marco quietly closed the SUV door after I climbed inside. As we pulled away, I glanced through the rain-streaked window. For just a second, I saw her walking alone beneath the flickering streetlights, her small figure slowly swallowed by the darkness. I told myself someone else would stop. I told myself she'd get home safely. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. By sunrise, I would discover that the only thing more dangerous than making the wrong choice is believing it didn't matter. The longest night of my life began with the shortest phone call. I had barely stepped into my office the next morning when Marco knocked once before opening the door. He never interrupted me unless something couldn't wait. One look at his face told me this wasn't about business. "Boss," he said quietly, "do you remember the woman from last night?" I looked up from the reports spread across my desk. Rain still streaked the windows behind him, though dawn had finally broken over the city. "The waitress?" He nodded. "Her name is Emily Carter." I frowned. "What about her?" Marco hesitated. "She never made it home." For a moment, the room seemed strangely silent. I leaned back in my chair, waiting for him to continue. "Her neighbor reported her missing this morning," he said. "She never picked up her daughter." My fingers stopped moving. Maybe her phone died. The police checked. Another pause. "No one has seen her since she left the diner." I told myself it had nothing to do with me. Adults disappeared for countless reasons every day. Missed buses, dead batteries, family emergencies. Yet one image refused to leave my mind. Emily standing in the rain with water dripping from her hair, smiling politely after hearing the word no. Thank you anyway. I pushed the memory aside. How did you hear about this? Marco glanced toward the window. The diner manager called one of our businesses nearby. He knows we have cameras facing the street. He hoped someone might have seen where she went. I stood without realizing it. Did they? Marco lowered his eyes. Not yet. 20 minutes later, I found myself standing inside the same diner where I had met her less than 12 hours earlier. The place felt completely different in daylight. The waitress who greeted customers with cheerful smiles last night was gone. Coffee sat untouched on tables. Conversations were whispered instead of spoken. Behind the counter, the manager rubbed his forehead with trembling hands. Mr. Russo, he said as I approached. I appreciate you coming. Tell me what happened. He swallowed hard. Emily always called if she was running late. His voice cracked, especially because of Lily. Her daughter. He nodded. 5 years old. Something tightened inside my chest. Emily never missed picking her up. Never. Maria, the cook, quietly placed a small pink lunchbox on the counter. She packed this before leaving, she whispered. She said Lily wanted strawberry sandwiches today. No one touched the lunchbox. It sat there like time itself had stopped. The neighbor kept Lily overnight, Maria continued. The poor little girl thinks her mom had to work another shift. I looked toward the empty booth where Emily had stood when she asked me for a ride. The chair remained exactly where it had been. I could almost hear her voice again. I don't live far. I closed my eyes for the briefest moment. A choice that had seemed so insignificant 12 hours ago suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Marco stepped beside me. Boss. Before he could finish, one of my security men hurried inside carrying a tablet. We recovered footage from the traffic cameras. He placed it in front of me. Grainy black and white video filled the screen. Emily walked alone beneath the streetlights exactly as I remembered. Then, 40 seconds later, a dark van slowed beside the curb. The camera angle couldn't show the conversation. It only showed the vehicle stopping, Emily disappearing behind it, and the empty sidewalk after it drove away. I stared at the frozen image, unable to look away. The last person who could have changed her path had been me. And for the first time in years, I realized that power means very little when it arrives one night too late. Children don't measure time the way adults do. They measure it in promises kept and promises broken. By late afternoon, I couldn't concentrate on anything except the image of the dark van disappearing into the rain. Every report on my desk blurred into meaningless words. Every phone call sounded distant. Emily Carter had become more than a missing persons case. She had become the consequence of a decision I couldn't undo. Marco stepped into my office once again. Boss, he said quietly. We found the neighbor. 20 minutes later, my SUV stopped outside a modest brick apartment building in Brooklyn. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old paint. Apartment 2B stood slightly open. A woman in her 60s greeted us with tired eyes. You must be Mr. Russo, she said softly. I'm Mrs. Henderson. I nodded. Thank you for seeing us. She looked past me at the security team before opening the door wider. She's in the living room. The apartment was small but spotless. Children's drawings covered one wall. Tiny shoes sat neatly beside the entrance. A pink backpack leaned against the sofa. Then I saw her. A little girl sat cross-legged on the carpet hugging a worn stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. She couldn't have been older than 5. Blonde curls framed her pale face. She was coloring quietly, completely unaware that her entire world had already changed. Mrs. Henderson knelt beside her. Lily, sweetheart. The little girl looked up with bright blue eyes. Yes. This is Mr. Russo. Lily smiled politely, just as her mother had smiled the night before. Hi. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I wasn't good with children. Men like me rarely had the chance to be. Still, I crouched to her level. Hello, Lily. She studied my face with innocent curiosity. Have you seen my mommy? The question landed harder than any threat I'd ever faced. I searched for words that didn't exist. Before I could answer, she continued speaking. Mrs. Henderson says Mommy got busy. She smiled with complete faith. She always comes back. No one in the room spoke. Lily looked toward the apartment door every few seconds, as if expecting footsteps in the hallway. On the coffee table sat a small paper crown decorated with glitter. "What's that?" I asked gently. Lily picked it up with careful hands. "Mommy promised we'd finish it today." She pointed to the unfinished stars glued along the edges. "It's for family day at school tomorrow." Her smile faded just a little. She forgot. Mrs. Henderson quietly turned away, wiping at her eyes. I looked around the apartment. Everything told the story of a woman trying her best. Bills stacked neatly beside the refrigerator. A sewing kit on the kitchen table. Children's books with repaired covers. Nothing expensive. Nothing wasted. Emily had built a life held together by determination instead of money. Marco approached carrying a small framed photograph he had found on the bookshelf. Emily stood in the picture with Lily sitting on her shoulders, both laughing beneath autumn leaves. They looked genuinely happy. "Boss," Marco whispered, "our investigators found something else." He handed me another tablet. A still image from a nearby security camera appeared. The same dark van. This time the license plate was partially visible. Only 4 numbers. But it was enough to begin. I looked back at Lily. She was placing the paper crown carefully into her tiny backpack. "So Mommy can see it tomorrow," she said with quiet confidence. I rose to my feet, every trace of hesitation gone. Yesterday, Emily had been a stranger asking for a ride home. Today, she was a mother whose little girl was still waiting by the door. I met Marco's eyes. "Call everyone," I said. "Every investigator. Every contact. Every camera operator. We are not treating this as a missing persons case anymore." My voice became colder than I intended. "We are bringing Emily Carter home." Regret has a strange way of sharpening your vision. Suddenly, every detail you ignored becomes the only thing you can see. Within an hour, my headquarters no longer resembled a corporate office. It had become a command center. Digital maps covered the walls. Security footage streamed across giant monitors. Phones rang without stopping. My investigators moved from desk to desk, comparing timelines, traffic cameras, and witness statements. Nobody questioned why a woman they had never met had suddenly become my highest priority. They only knew I had given one order: find Emily Carter. I stood before the largest screen as Marco approached with a folder. "The partial plate matches 4 vehicles," he reported. 3 have verified locations. 1 is still unaccounted for. Who owns it? A shell company. He placed another document beside it. Registered 2 years ago. Fake address. Cash purchase. My jaw tightened. Not random. No. Marco shook his head. Someone planned to disappear. Another investigator hurried toward us. "Boss, we tracked Emily's phone." Every conversation in the room stopped. "Where?" I asked. "It sent one final signal 32 minutes after she left the diner." He zoomed in on a map of Brooklyn, near the old industrial district. Then it went offline. I stared at the blinking red dot. 32 minutes. If I had simply driven her home, she would have reached her apartment in less than 15. That number echoed inside my mind like a sentence I could never escape. Marco quietly placed a warm cup of coffee beside me. I never touched it. Hours passed. More information slowly surfaced. Emily worked 6 days a week at the diner. On Sundays, she cleaned offices downtown. Every paycheck went toward rent, groceries, and Lily's preschool tuition. No criminal record. No debts. No enemies. No hidden relationships. Just a hardworking mother trying to give her daughter a better future. One photograph caught my attention. Emily volunteering at a neighborhood food drive, smiling as she handed groceries to an elderly couple. Another showed her reading stories to children at the local library. She had spent so much of her life helping strangers. Last night, when she needed one small favor from a stranger, I had walked away. "Boss." Marco's voice broke the silence again. We recovered another camera angle. The footage appeared on the screen. Emily walked past a convenience store moments before the van approached. This angle showed something the first video had missed. She wasn't forced inside. She stepped closer because someone rolled down the passenger window and spoke to her. She hesitated, looked uncertain, then glanced down the empty street behind her. There was no taxi, no bus, no one else. Finally, she leaned closer to listen. Seconds later, the sliding door opened. The camera lost sight of her. "Can we enhance the audio?" I asked. One technician shook his head. "Too much traffic noise." Another investigator raised his hand. "Boss, we interviewed the cashier." The room turned toward him. He remembers seeing the van. Did he hear anything? Only one sentence. He looked down at his notebook before reading it aloud. Your daughter is waiting. We can take you home. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. They hadn't threatened her. They had used the one thing every mother would trust. Lily. Emily had climbed into that van believing she was getting home to her little girl. I slowly closed the folder in front of me. The room waited for my next instruction. Listen carefully, I said, my voice calm enough to make everyone stand a little straighter. This isn't just an investigation anymore. I looked once more at Emily's smiling photograph on the monitor. Someone used a mother's love against her. The silence that followed felt heavier than any gunshot. Find out who they are. I met every pair of eyes in the room. Because this time, they're not hiding from the police. Hope is a fragile thing. It survives not because the odds are good, but because the heart refuses to surrender. Night settled over the city once again, yet no one inside my headquarters spoke about going home. Empty coffee cups covered the tables. Computer screens cast pale light across exhausted faces. Every investigator understood that somewhere, a little girl was falling asleep believing her mother would walk through the door by morning. I couldn't let that belief die. Around midnight, Marco entered carrying another folder. This time, there was something different in his expression. Not relief, not certainty, but momentum. Boss, he said, we found the van. Every head in the room turned toward him. He spread several photographs across the conference table. Grainy surveillance images showed the same dark vehicle entering an abandoned warehouse district before sunrise. It never appeared leaving. How long ago? I asked. About 6 hours after Emily disappeared. Who owns the building? Another shell company. I wasn't surprised anymore. Whoever planned this had erased every obvious trail. But people make mistakes. They always do. One of my analysts enlarged another image from a traffic camera. There. He pointed to a small reflection in the warehouse window. A second SUV had been parked nearby. Different color. Different registration. This one belonged to a legitimate delivery business. Track every driver, I ordered. 45 minutes later, one name remained. Anthony Blake, 38. Temporary contractor. Fired 2 months earlier after falsifying paperwork. My investigators located his last known address. Empty. His phone had been discarded near the waterfront that afternoon. He knew someone would eventually start looking. Marco slid another document toward me. Anthony isn't the organizer. Explain. His financial records changed 3 weeks ago. Several unusually large cash deposits appeared on the screen. Enough to tempt someone desperate. Enough to make a man ignore his conscience. He was hired, Marco concluded. Yes. I studied the timeline in silence. Emily hadn't been targeted because of who she was. She had simply crossed paths with people searching for someone vulnerable enough to trust a familiar lie. That realization somehow hurt even more. She wasn't taken because she made an enemy. She was taken because she was kind enough to believe another human being. My phone vibrated. Mrs. Henderson. I answered immediately. Mr. Russo? Her voice sounded tired. I'm sorry to bother you. You're never a bother. Is Lily all right? A brief pause. She wouldn't go to sleep. I closed my eyes. Why? She left the hallway light on. Mrs. Henderson struggled to keep her voice steady. She said, Mommy doesn't like coming home in the dark. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Finally, I asked, can I talk to her? A soft rustling followed before a tiny voice reached my ear. Hello. Hi, Lily. Mr. Russo? Yes. Did you find my mommy? The question carried complete trust. The kind only children are capable of giving. I looked around the operations room, where dozens of people still searched through maps and camera feeds. Not yet, I admitted quietly. But we're looking everywhere. She was silent for a moment. Then she whispered, Please tell her I kept the light on. The line went quiet again before Mrs. Henderson gently took back the phone. I lowered it slowly, unable to move. Marco watched me from across the room. He didn't ask what Lily had said. He didn't need to. I turned toward the wall-sized map covered in red markers. Somewhere inside those streets, a mother was fighting to come home. Somewhere, she was probably wondering whether her daughter thought she had abandoned her. I straightened my jacket and looked at every investigator still working despite the hour. Nobody leaves tonight, I said firmly. Emily Carter has been waiting long enough. Then I looked back at the glowing map. And so has her little girl. The difference between giving up and moving forward is often a single clue that everyone else overlooks. It was nearly 4 in the morning when exhaustion settled over the operations room like a heavy fog. Several investigators had fallen asleep in their chairs. Others stared silently at endless streams of surveillance footage. No one wanted to admit we were running out of leads. Emily had been missing for more than 24 hours. Every hour mattered. Marco walked toward me carrying a sealed evidence bag. "Boss," he said quietly. "One of our teams searched the warehouse district on foot. Inside the bag lay a small silver bracelet decorated with a tiny heart charm. I recognized it immediately. It was on Emily's wrist in the photograph from Lily's birthday. Where was this found?" I asked. "Behind warehouse 12. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Panic clouds judgment. Calm reveals patterns. I studied the photographs taken at the scene. Tire marks. Fresh footprints. A loading dock. Nothing unusual until one image caught my attention. A delivery receipt lay half-soaked beneath a wooden pallet. The address had been torn away, but one logo remained. A regional cold storage company. "Trace every shipment connected to this company within the last 48 hours, I ordered. My analysts immediately began searching. 10 minutes later, one route stood out. A refrigerated truck had entered the industrial district shortly after midnight, but never completed its scheduled delivery. Its GPS signal disappeared for almost 90 minutes before reappearing on a highway leading north. "Can we track the driver?" Marco asked. "Already doing it," another investigator replied. Seconds later, a satellite image appeared on the largest monitor. The missing GPS signal had returned near an abandoned fruit packing facility outside the city limits. The building had officially closed 3 years earlier. No registered employees. No security contract. No recent inspections. Invisible to almost everyone. Almost. The room fell silent as everyone looked toward me. I picked up Emily's bracelet once more. It wasn't proof she was there, but it was the first direction that made sense. "Prepare the convoy," I said. Marco hesitated. "Boss, should we notify the authorities?" I looked toward the map. "Yes." He seemed surprised. "We'll share everything we know." This was never about claiming credit. It was about bringing a mother home safely. If more people searching increased her chances, then pride had no place in the decision. Within minutes, several black SUVs rolled quietly out of the underground garage. Dawn had not yet broken. Fog drifted across the empty highway as our convoy moved north. Inside my vehicle, no one spoke. I kept replaying the last conversation I had with Emily. "Could you possibly give me a ride?" The sentence had followed me through every hour of the search. I wondered if she had blamed herself for asking. I hoped she hadn't. The only person responsible for that regret was me. Marco finally broke the silence. "Boss." "Yes." "If she's there." He paused before finishing. "What if we're too late?" I looked through the windshield as the first light of morning began to touch the horizon. For the first time since this nightmare began, I answered without hesitation. "Then we make sure Lily never has to wonder whether anyone tried." The convoy turned onto a narrow gravel road surrounded by abandoned warehouses and silent fields. In the distance, the old packing facility slowly emerged from the mist. No lights, no movement, just an aging building standing alone against the pale morning sky. Yet something about the stillness felt wrong. I reached for the door handle before the SUVs had completely stopped. My heart told me we were closer than ever before. And somewhere beyond those weathered walls, I prayed Emily Carter was still holding on long enough to find her way back to the little girl who had left the hallway light on. Sometimes redemption begins with the courage to open a single door. The old packing facility looked abandoned from the outside. Broken windows reflected the pale light of dawn. Rust stained the metal walls. Tall weeds pushed through cracked concrete as though nature itself had forgotten this place. But forgotten places often hide remembered crimes. I stepped out of the SUV before the engine stopped. Marco joined me immediately, scanning the silent property. "Perimeter is clear," he whispered. "No visible movement." I studied the building for several seconds. Too quiet. The loading dock doors were slightly open. Fresh tire tracks cut through the morning dew. Someone had been here recently. "Stay alert," I said calmly. "Nobody rushes." We entered through separate doors. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight leaking from holes in the roof. Empty wooden crates lined the walls. Every footstep echoed across the enormous warehouse. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily from a broken pipe. Then I heard it. A faint metallic sound. Not machinery. Chains moving. I raised one hand. Everyone froze. The sound came again. Softer this time. Marco pointed toward a hallway disappearing behind old refrigeration units. We moved carefully, one step at a time. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy steel door. It wasn't locked. It was simply closed. My pulse remained steady as I reached for the handle. The hinges groaned quietly when I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit by a single window. Emily sat on a chair near the far wall. Her hands were loosely secured with plastic restraints that had already begun to loosen. She looked exhausted. Her hair was tangled. Her face was pale. But the moment she looked up, I knew one thing before she spoke. She was alive. Her blue eyes widened in disbelief. For several silent seconds, neither of us moved. "Emily," I said gently. She blinked as though trying to decide whether I was real. "You?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You came." Those two words struck harder than anything I had heard in years. I crossed the room slowly and knelt beside her. "I'm sorry this took so long." My pocket knife sliced cleanly through the restraints. She rubbed her wrists but didn't attempt to stand immediately. She looked toward the doorway, fear returning to her expression. "The men, they're gone," Marco answered after checking the surrounding rooms. "They left before we arrived." Emily closed her eyes, breathing deeply for the first time in what must have felt like forever. I removed my jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. The oversized fabric nearly swallowed her small frame. "Lily," she whispered suddenly, panic returning. "Where's Lily?" "Safe," I answered without hesitation. "She's with your neighbor." Tears filled Emily's eyes instantly. Does she think?" Her voice broke. "She thinks you're coming home." Emily lowered her head, covering her face with trembling hands. Not because she was frightened anymore, because hope hurt almost as much as fear after being gone for so long. I waited quietly until she looked at me again. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you here?" The question deserved the truth. "Because the last time you asked me for help." I paused, feeling the weight of every word. I said no. Emily searched my face in silence. Then, with tears still glistening in her eyes, she gave the faintest shake of her head. "You didn't know?" "No," I admitted. "But I know now." For the first time since this nightmare began, Emily managed a fragile smile. It wasn't because everything was suddenly better. It was because someone had finally come back for her. And as the morning sunlight slowly filled the room, I realized the ride I had refused to give her days ago was about to become the most important journey of my life. The hardest apologies are not spoken with words. They are spoken by showing up when someone no longer expects you to. The drive back to Brooklyn was quieter than any journey I had ever taken. Rain had finally stopped. The morning sun pushed through scattered clouds, washing the city in soft golden light as though the world had decided to begin again. Emily sat beside me in the back seat of the SUV, wrapped in my jacket. She stared out the window without saying much. Every passing neighborhood seemed unfamiliar to her after everything she had endured. I didn't interrupt the silence. Some wounds need peace before they need conversation. Marco drove carefully, avoiding sudden turns. No one answered phone calls unless absolutely necessary. For once, the convoy behind us felt less like protection and more like a respectful distance. About 20 minutes into the drive, Emily finally spoke. "Did Lily cry?" she asked quietly. I looked toward her. Her fingers remained tightly wrapped around the silver bracelet we had recovered. "Every child cries," I answered honestly. "But she never stopped believing you'd come home." Emily closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "She always leaves the hallway light on when I'm late." I nodded slowly. She told me. Emily covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her again. "I was so afraid she'd think I left her." "She never did." My voice remained calm. "She trusted you." After a long silence, she turned toward me. "Why did you help me?" It was the question I had been answering inside my own mind since the night we met. I didn't hide behind excuses. "Because I made a mistake." She waited. "When you asked me for a ride." I stared through the windshield. "I convinced myself someone else would help you." Emily didn't speak. I built my entire life believing distance kept people safe. I told myself strangers weren't my responsibility. I took a slow breath. "Then I met your daughter." Emily's expression softened. "Lily changed that." I smiled faintly. "No." I looked at her. She reminded me what responsibility actually looks like. The SUV turned onto her street. Before we reached the apartment building, Another vehicle pulled quietly to the curb ahead of us. Mrs. Henderson stood beside it holding Lily's tiny hand. The little girl spotted the black SUV instantly. "Mommy!" she screamed before anyone could stop her. She broke into a run across the sidewalk. Emily was already opening the door before the vehicle completely stopped. Mother and daughter met halfway between the cars. Lily threw both arms around her mother's waist with all the strength a 5-year-old could find. Emily dropped to her knees and held her so tightly it seemed impossible they had ever been apart. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They simply cried together beneath the warm morning sunlight. I remained beside the SUV, watching from a respectful distance. This reunion didn't belong to me. It belonged to them. Mrs. Henderson walked over slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. I shook my head. I should have done it sooner. Emily finally looked toward me while still holding Lily in her arms. Our eyes met across the quiet street. She walked over, Lily's small hand still wrapped around hers. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Emily offered me something I wasn't sure I deserved. "I don't blame you," she said gently. "The people who lied to me made their own choices." She paused before continuing. "You made yours." I lowered my eyes. "And I'd spend the rest of my life changing it if I could." Emily studied me for a long moment before giving the smallest smile. "Maybe that's how redemption begins." Lily looked up at me with complete innocence. "Mr. Russo?" "Yes." She smiled brightly. "Thank you for bringing my mommy home." No courtroom, no victory, no celebration. Just one little girl holding her mother's hand again. And somehow, that meant more than every empire I had ever built. People think redemption arrives in one extraordinary moment. They are wrong. Redemption is built from ordinary choices made differently than before. 3 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. The newspapers eventually stopped writing about Emily's disappearance after the authorities arrested the people responsible through evidence gathered during the investigation. The headlines faded. The city moved on. But some stories are never meant for headlines. They belong in the quiet spaces between ordinary days. My own life changed in ways no business deal or victory had ever accomplished. Every Thursday evening, without fail, I drove across the city myself. No convoy, no meetings, no excuses. The small neighborhood diner still stood beneath the same weathered sign. Emily had returned to work for a short time, more to thank her co-workers than because she needed to. Soon afterward, a local foundation quietly purchased the diner from its retiring owner. The paperwork never mentioned my name. Emily became its manager instead of its employee. She argued with me for nearly an hour after discovering what had happened. "I can't accept this," she insisted. I smiled. "You're not accepting charity." She folded her arms. "Then what is it?" "An investment." She laughed despite herself. "In a diner?" I shook my head gently. "In someone who never stopped taking care of other people." She never completely believed my explanation, but she accepted the keys. That was enough. Lily adapted faster than either of us expected. Children have an extraordinary gift for healing without forgetting. Every Thursday, she insisted on saving me a seat by the window after school. We would share grilled cheese sandwiches while she proudly explained every new drawing, spelling test, or impossible dream she had invented that week. One rainy afternoon, almost exactly like the night everything began, she looked at me with complete seriousness. "Mr. Russo?" "Yes." "You're smiling more now." Emily glanced up from behind the counter, pretending not to listen. I chuckled softly. "Am I?" Lily nodded. "Mom says people smile when they feel safe." Her words stayed with me long after we finished lunch. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered once again over the city. Emily locked the diner's front door and stepped outside, pulling her coat around her shoulders. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. We both remembered another rainy night. Another closed door. Another decision. I walked toward my car and opened the passenger door before she could say a word. She looked at me, then smiled knowingly. "You didn't even wait for me to ask." I returned the smile. I promised myself I never would. Lily climbed into the back seat, humming happily as she buckled herself in. Emily settled into the passenger seat beside me. The rain began falling softly against the windshield, but this time it sounded different. Not like a warning, more like a memory that had finally found peace. As I started the engine, Emily quietly rested one hand over mine for just a second. "Thank you," she whispered. I looked ahead at the familiar road stretching through the rain. For what? Her eyes reflected the warm glow of the dashboard lights. For coming back. I drove them home that evening. Then I drove them home the next Thursday. And the Thursday after that. Somewhere along the way, the journey stopped feeling like an apology. It simply became where I belonged. Looking back now, I understand something I wish I had known from the beginning. Power can open every door in a city. Money can solve problems most people never face. But neither can erase one moment of indifference. Only compassion can do that. And sometimes, the most important ride you'll ever give is the one you almost refused.